Good evening, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for giving up what is probably a warm and sunny evening to join us for the David Goodbourn annual lecture this year. My name is Clara Rushbrook. I am co-principal of Northern Baptist College, which is part of the Luther King Centre, and I've been involved in the Network for Theology and Justice since its inception. We're very grateful to Churches Together in Britain and Ireland for hosting us this evening, and especially to Mike. And we're hoping that the tech all goes smoothly. The recording will be available from CTBI afterwards. Please do type in your comments and your questions into the Q&A. It's quite hard for those of us up here on the panel because we don't really get to see what you're thinking. So the Q&A is your way of communicating with us. And hopefully we'll have a time at the end to have more of a discussion and more of a look at some of those questions and those comments. I'd also like to welcome here with me this evening Dr. Helen Cameron and Reverend Jane Day, who will be giving our lecture this evening on the research that they and many other co-researchers have been involved in, exploring the experience and of a wide diversity of women in Baptist ministry. Helen is a research fellow in Baptist Studies at Regent's Park College in Oxford and was the co-leader and principal investigator for Project Violet. Her research interests are very much as a practical theologian who is interested in participatory approaches to research. She has published in the area of congregational studies spanning both theological and social scientific approaches, so she was ideally placed to co-lead Project Violet. And Jane has until very recently been the Centenary Development Enabler for Baptists Together and is also a tutor at Regent's Park College, Oxford, and co-leader for Project Violet. Jane has worked in the areas of pastoral care, of coaching and spiritual direction, all of which she uses to great effect in order to encourage people and especially leaders to be the best selves that they can be. They were supported in delivering the project by Angie Bryant, who works as the PA to the General Secretary of Baptists Together. Don't think Angie's around this evening, but we also need to offer her our thanks. I'm not going to spoil it anymore by telling you more about Project Violet at this stage. I'll pass over to Helen and Jane in a minute and they can explain more. But before I hand over to them, I would just like to say a little bit about David Goodbourn and why we hold this lecture each year in his honour. David was an educator and a communist who served a number of significant roles over his lifetime, roles that touched on many of our own journeys here. He was a tutor at Northern Baptist College, although it was a little bit before my time. He worked on lay education within the Baptist Church and the Church of Scotland. He was General Secretary of Churches in Britain and Ireland and President of Luther King House. His work and his ministry were very much one of sowing seeds of justice and education that has been so important to all of us involved in the Network for Theology and Justice. But I'll remember him best for the gentle humour and the deep questions we sometimes discussed on the train on the way home from numerous meetings at Baptist House. But that's enough from me. Let me hand over to Helen and Jane. Helen, I believe you knew David too.
Yes, thank you very much, Clara, for that introduction. I had the pleasure of briefly working with David when I accompanied CTBI, the steering committee, for 18 months, starting in autumn 2004. It was a time when the steering committee were preparing for significant change. Now, as we know, accompanying depends upon the accompanied being willing to have someone alongside them. From my first encounter with David, I knew that we shared a love of good process and were willing to trust the process of accompaniment to bear fruit. I learned a great deal from the time I spent with David and enjoyed his dry wit and his ability to surf the ebbing tide of formal ecumenism. I'd like to share this quote from his writings, which is as true of participatory research, which we're going to discuss this evening, as it is of his first passion, which was adult education. He said this: "Holistic education is a delicate plant, always under threat, always in danger of being choked by larger and more aggressive plants. But it is a plant which has the power to heal and transform. It needs to be nurtured." And I can probably add amen to that.
Amen.
So to move on to the talk which Jane and I are going to give to you over the next 45 minutes, we started working together in May 2021 to design research that would help us understand more fully the theological, missional and structural obstacles women ministers face in the Baptist community in Great Britain, and to identify some ways forward. We had a commitment to working in a participatory way so that the research was with women rather than about them. We are at the moment working through what it means for us as co-leaders of Project Violet to speak about the project now that the research phase has concluded. The research, there is a, excuse me, the research findings and the knowledge that has come from Project Violet are knowledge that has been co-created by Baptist women for purposes which they have determined. There is a danger that we now treat this knowledge in an extractive way for our own academic purposes. Although we hold that concern in tension with a desire to disseminate what we have done widely to academic and church audiences. At this stage, we feel able to offer two types of reflections. First, evaluative reflections on our intentions as we co-led and designed the research. And secondly, what we noticed as an insider and outsider to the Baptist community during this deep immersion in Baptist life. This paper offers an evaluation of the design of Project Violet as a contribution to addressing epistemic injustice. That is, injustice that minoritized groups experience because their knowledge is not treated as valid in the making of policy or the doing of theology. We will start by locating this paper in relation to two key books from the literature on women's injustice, and then offer a description of Project Violet before reflecting on 5 themes that address our topic of creating just knowledge.
Thanks, Helen. Good evening, everyone. We are treading well-worn ground in addressing women's experiences of injustice. So rather than try to offer you a comprehensive literature review in 10 minutes, we have each selected a book that has resonated with us as we have worked on this project. I want to start with my choice. To quote, "To be self-confident is the imperative of our time. As gender, racial and class inequalities deepen, women are increasingly called on to believe in themselves." These are the opening lines of a book called Confidence Culture by Shani Orgad and Rosalind Gill. The authors argue that women have not been taken seriously, and rather than focusing on the institutional challenges as to why that might be, they suggest that we have assumed that women need more confidence to speak out, hence putting the responsibility squarely at the feet of individuals. Confidence culture requires individuals to change and not institutions. I suggest their work is a helpful way for us to think about issues of justice for women, where so often, whatever the challenges faced by girls and women today, the diagnosis offered is she lacks confidence, and the solution is to be found in assertiveness training, coaching, workshops, self-help books, and movements such as Lean In. In society today, there is a lot of pressure on women to be more confident. When I came across Orgad and Gill's work, I pondered my own job description, in which I am invited to identify, coach, and encourage women who are ready to enter senior roles in churches across Baptist Together and translocal ministry. I can see now that rarely have institutions stopped to interrogate the structures and systems that women are being placed into. And perhaps the individualised solutions have not worked to create a more just society, just workplace, or just church, because women were never the problem. Orgad and Gill's work introduces 5 aspects of confidence: body confidence, confidence at work, confident relating, mothering, and confidence without borders. recognising it's a global issue. Confidence culture is not diminishing, so what might the alternatives be? In short, I think it's about resistance and seeking alternatives. And so for each of the 5 domains of confidence, the authors helpfully put forward some suggestions. One example they offer in relation to work and contrast to many of the self-help advice books is to promote alternatives and resist the dominant culture. They cite the example of the best-selling book, Slay in Your Lane, the Black Girl Bible, which is a collection of essays based on the experiences of Black women. The authors of the book tell stories of how Black women have been leaning in for years, but this is often at the cost of being stereotyped as strong or angry. They argue that the structural roots of women's struggles and obstacles are overlooked and seek a new narrative. And maybe this is our invitation too, as we seek alternative narratives and uncover the structural roots of injustice that women face in all aspects of society and culture, and commit to fixing the system and not the women.
For me, Chloe Gott's book on the experience of women in Ireland's maudlin laundries is a powerful illustration of the idea of epistemic injustice. The philosopher Miranda Fricker was the first to articulate this idea, arguing that some classes of people are wronged specifically in their capacity as a knower. Testimonial injustice occurs when hearers are prejudiced against the knowledge being offered and so deflate its credibility. Hermeneutical injustice occurs where an experience cannot be named because there are no recognised categories in which to express it. The case of the maudlin laundries has recently been popularised in the 2024 film based upon the book by Claire Keegan, Small Things Like These. Women in Ireland who are deemed to have broken social convention by becoming pregnant outside marriage, being mentally ill, or deviating from the wishes of their family, were incarcerated and made to work in laundries, sometimes for their entire lives. The Irish state has made attempts to address this large-scale injustice perpetrated by religious orders with the knowledge and assistance of both church and state. Chloe Gott undertook a secondary analysis of 81 oral histories collected from some survivors and those associated with these institutions, showing how these women were silenced when incarcerated by minimising their contact with each other, and silenced on release by the shame of having been in these institutions. They were further marginalised by attempts to research their experience when expert researchers and policymakers interpreted their stories and gave an account of what justice should look like. Project Violet has sought to counter epistemic injustice by allowing women to speak to each other in spaces that minimise the dangers of being brave and allowed the expression of both anger and sadness. It has enabled a group of women to make requests for change that are owned collectively rather than being attributed to the autobiography of any one woman. It has allowed women to define what counts as justice in Baptist life by addressing everyday language and behaviour, the accepted ways of doing things, and theology. To give an example, tackling hermeneutical injustice has meant introducing a concept such as himpathy to make it possible to articulate the gratitude felt to male supporters by women, whilst also being able to challenge the status quo over which those men preside.
I will now introduce Project Violet and outline the scale of the project in more detail. The findings were released on the 2nd of May 2024, in which the women asked for 57 requests for change. The Baptist Union Council received commitments to act upon those requests on 23rd of October 2024, with an agreement to present an accountability report to the Baptist Union Council in October this year, celebrating the progress made and asking what more remains to be done. Before I talk about the phases of the project, I want to say something about how Project Violet came about. The Baptist Union of Great Britain took a courageous decision on the back of a proposal that arose from the Gender Justice Hub and the Black and Brown Women Ministers Network to introduce a new post within the Baptist Union as a way of celebrating the centenary of women being ordained for Baptist ministry, yet recognising that significant challenges still exist for present-day Baptist women. I was appointed to that role, and you won't be surprised to hear me say that after 3 months in post, I noticed that I could listen to women 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and nothing would change systemically or structurally, which is why I identified the need for a sustained piece of research. I then had a conversation with Helen, which is where the fun and creativity began. If you're wondering why the name Project Violet, we named it Project Violet because of Violet Hedger. Violet was the first woman minister to enter the process for training as a Baptist minister at Regent's Park College in 1919. So turning to Project Violet, the first phase of the project was the Mosaic phase, in which we invited all serving women Baptist ministers to tell their story in no more than 1,000 words, something of the joys and sorrows in ministry. We received over 50 responses, which was about a 25% response rate of those who were eligible to reply. The next phase was stakeholder engagement, in which we wanted to hear from all the networks that have connections with women ministers. Myself and Helen hosted 44 meetings, and this was key in building relationships, as well as providing our stakeholders with an opportunity to reflect. The next phase was the work with the co-researchers, which was the most lengthy phase of the project, in which we invited 16 women working in 4 groups to act as co-researchers using Theological Action Research. Each co-researcher identified a question about their experience as a woman and investigated that question using an appropriate methodology. They were supported during this phase with one-to-one coaching support from me and one-to-one researcher support from Helen. The women then met in each group to reflect upon their data and draw out both lessons that they have learned and also the changes they wish to ask for in which Baptist life is conducted. Their research reports were shared with a group of 3 women theological educators, of which Clara is one, who met and reflected on them. Each co-researcher group then met together with the theological reflector group and identified shared learning, and in some cases added to the requests for change they were making. As each woman co-researcher identified her question, we were then able to return to the Mosaic reflections and see whether the question she raised was present in those reflections. All but one of the questions was evidenced. In April 2024, we then held a 24-hour conference with all the project participants, inviting them to take an overview of the project and its findings to prioritise the changes they were seeking. Alongside the work with co-researchers, we were also eager to hear from our ecumenical colleagues. In November 2023, we held a workshop with 12 women from 6 different traditions as they identified the gifts and challenges of being a woman and a minister in their tradition. And we were able to host that with grateful thanks to monies we received from the Pauline Webb Ecumenical Fund through Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. So in May 2024, the findings were released along with the 57 requests for change from the different stakeholders in Baptist life. In October 2024, we were able to present a commitment to action report with all the changes those stakeholders have agreed to make. In October 2025, an accountability report will go to Baptist Union Council, reporting on the progress and asking what remains to be done. In January of this year, we also hosted an international symposium in which we invited academically engaged Baptist women to respond to the findings. We heard 33 papers from women representing 10 countries. In conclusion, as we await the responses from the Council later this year, we also note that the Council resolved to hold this period as a season of lament for all that the research has discovered until the Baptist Assembly just last weekend. And all that I have described is documented on the Project Violet website. And that's the story of Project Violet to date, a 3-year research project where we are now handing the baton over to Baptists in Great Britain to implement the commitments to actions that they have made. After 160 years of women, 106 rather, years of women in ministry, the Project Violet researchers think it's fair to ask for change, and the stakeholders across the denomination have taken a courageous step in taking women's ministry seriously and engaging with these issues.
We're now going to move on to the final section of our paper, in which we're going to discuss the 5 challenges we encountered in generating just knowledge, which is our theme this evening, and reflect on those. Jane will speak to some of the themes and I'll speak to others. So Jane, let me hand back to you for the first of our 5 themes.
Certainly can. So the initial phase of stakeholder engagement was to awaken with those with the power to change. And our first task was to identify the most obvious stakeholders within the structures. In identifying the specific groups, Helen and I spent an afternoon together. We've spent many of those, not quite locked in a room, but with a big table and a pile of post-it notes, and mapped out whom we needed to speak with. The Baptist Union is just over 1,800 local churches, is supported by 13 regional associations, 3 specialist teams based in Didcot, and 6 Baptist colleges. And so these groups ran natural stakeholders with whom we sought engagement. We also have other networks which, whilst not necessarily staffed or resourced by the Baptist Union, have influence across the denomination and which shapes women's experiences of ministry and offers a space where women's experience in ministry is discussed. For example, a number of women Baptist ministers facilitate a Facebook group with nearly 350 women. It is not uncommon in that group to hear stories about women's experiences of ministry. We have a Larger Churches Forum, which is another network for ministers of larger churches. At their last conference in October 2024, there were 35 attendees, with 4 women and 31 men. In previous conferences, they have reflected on the lack of women pastoring our larger churches and raised questions about how they might respond. Another example is Fresh Streams, which is a network that seeks to equip, inspire, connect and resource leaders and leadership teams. In 2007, the network issued the Blackley Declaration, calling for further reflection and action on the place of women in ministry within the Baptist denomination. These are just 3 examples of other stakeholders with the power to bring about change. In total, we hosted over 40 stakeholder meetings where we outlined the purpose of the project and invited people to take an interest in the project and in due course respond to its findings. Following the presentation, we then facilitated a conversation and asked each group to respond to the question, if you could ask one question about the place of women ministers in the Baptist community, what would it be? And looking back, that was a really important part of the process. And we think, as a result of such engagement, this has enabled a positive response with regard to the request for change and subsequent actions. To date, all the associations, colleges and specialist teams have made a response to the request for change. For example, we were invited to facilitate the 24-hour college conference, which had a sole focus on discussing Project Violet and how colleges might respond. It does seem that this new type of knowledge generated by Project Violet has engaged most of those with the power to change things.
So I'm going to pick up now and address our second theme, which is to go back to the mosaic phase of the research and think about that as both private and public knowledge. That was the phase where we invited women to write about their experiences of ministry. In looking at what might bring about change, we were told that stories about women's ministry would be found persuasive. Yet, women gave examples of where they had shown vulnerability in telling their stories of injustice and it had been used against them. Women also told us that their stories were accepted when they followed a narrative arc that was salvific, but not one that was tragic. They felt good news was extracted from them and broadcast, whereas bad news went unheard. Our challenge at the beginning of the project was how to listen widely without running that risk. We took an approach pioneered by one of my doctoral students in Australia, Christine Farragher, who, in studying women's experience of ministry in the Salvation Army, invited every woman minister to send in a written reflection of up to 1,000 words on the joys and sorrows of their ministry. In extending a similar invitation to every serving accredited woman minister, we said that their reflections would be used by co-researchers, but not more widely, and that this material would go into the Angus Archive, which is the National Baptist Archive, embargoed for 30 years. This was our guarantee that there would be a historic record that bears witness to injustice that future generations can access. As Jane has said, we took the research questions of our co-researchers and used them to interrogate that data and found evidence for all of them but one, showing that our co-researchers' questions were ones that other women were experiencing and asking. The one that was missing was the issue of disability. Later in the project, we did a briefing with potential co-researchers with a disability, and they said they had not had the capacity to take part in this mosaic phase. An aspect of women's self-editing, which is often interpreted as a lack of confidence, is that they often ask themselves the question, is it only me, before they raise a concern. Reading anonymised extracts from the mosaic reflections gave our co-researchers the knowledge that it wasn't only them. Jane printed off all the reflections we received and put them in a decorative box, which we took to important occasions such as the Baptist Union Council and Baptist Assembly, enabling us to show symbolically that the women were present but unheard. It's important to acknowledge the disadvantages of this approach, that some women who wanted to respond didn't because they lacked the time to do so or were fearful of repercussions. This approach hasn't contributed to the greater visibility of women as role models. A project where this has been done is the Call to Serve project at the Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies in Canada, which has created a podcast using oral histories from women ministers. So creating just knowledge involves making difficult decisions about what is public and what is private knowledge. We were public about the fact that private knowledge had been collected and that it spoke to the real concerns of our co-researchers.
So in this section, I want to draw on the data from 14 semi-structured interviews with the co-researchers that I conducted as part of my doctoral studies. The first issue is the value of women-only spaces. And I suggest that as a result of creating a space for the women to meet together, to reflect, to discuss their research, this helped them to find their voice, which subsequently led them to make their own requests. To quote, "I think you've brought us together and we won't be silenced. You've given us each other and we're not going anywhere." Another participant, "I think there's something about the solidarity of the project, that there's so many women involved and I'm really excited." And another, I suppose the fact that we are journeying with a whole lot of women, it has the potential to change for those that follow. It seems that there was energy, solidarity and excitement because of the group accompaniment offered to these women. Secondly, as a result of the women meeting together, the data pointed to examples of them finding their voice. For example, one participant talked about her experiences of working nationally and shared, "I think I feel confident to use my voice in a different way rather than a totally new way." Another participant shared how the different sorts of accompaniment made her stronger and bolder and able to speak into things. A further participant narrated how she would go quiet in a room because if it had already been said, what was the point? When challenged by her accompanier, who said, "You're not there unless you're heard," she shared, "From that point onwards, I began to make sure I said something, even if I thought it was a waste of space to speak. There's probably an impact in there which might be quite small, but maybe bigger than I think." Thirdly, one participant where we can trace her story of her being accompanied through Project Violet, how she then finds her voice and the subsequent requests that she makes. She told me this: "I think without the Project Violet accompaniment, I wouldn't have suggested that justice needed to be a paid part of the team, and then any role wouldn't be here, and then my role wouldn't be here." So actually, there's something that's quite important there, if you think about it, because without Project Violet, I wouldn't have done the research without being encouraged to think about this particular topic. So it's really quite significant if you think about it. It's perhaps too early to notice the impact of all of these women, but I think it will be really fascinating to journey with her and other co-researchers to see what further impacts might emerge with the value or with regard to the value of women-only spaces and helping the co-researchers find their voice in the creation of just knowledge.
The fourth theme we want to address is the doing of theology, and thinking particularly about theology which is drawn from experience and not from normative statements. Practical and contextual theologies have only recently started to find a place in Baptist life. In the past, the emphasis has been on recovering Baptist history, articulating systematic theology based upon Baptist distinctives, and upon biblical studies. In the UK, much of that theology has been done by men in universities and theological colleges and has spoken into the life of the church through either reports authored by committees or single authored works. The dominant modes of discourse have been descriptive, propositional, and hermeneutic. There are examples of men who have used these approaches to affirm the ministry of women. But there have been limited opportunities to do theology that started from the experience of women. So the challenges we faced were to do theology that started from women's experience of ministry and to communicate that theology in a way that did justice to women, but could also be heard by the stakeholders we were asking to change. Let me quote at some length from the introduction to the Theological Reflection report that was released as part of the findings. We are offering a theology of discernment, by which we mean that this theology that arose from listening to God and to each other, drawing on Baptist ways of believing, our love of Scripture, and enfolded in prayer. We brought all that we are to these conversations of discernment, our minds, bodies, souls, and emotions, as we listen deeply to what God was saying. Our report arises from a process of reflection which enabled us to listen to God and to each other over a number of months. Now, this may be different from your previous experience of doing theology. Often the focus of our theological tradition has been the prioritizing of making logical and convincing arguments. Perhaps that was your experience as a student. Here, however, we have sought to value the process of conversation and the experience and understanding of each co-researcher. This is reflected in the way in which each report contains more than one voice and represents more than one context, identity, and type of ministry. It is designed to start a conversation rather than be the last word. Try to read this report as an invitation from another Baptist to join in a conversation, rather than as an agenda paper for a meeting. We encourage you to ask, how does this report resonate with your understanding of what it is to be a Baptist? What echoes are you hearing of Scripture and the theology you are familiar with? What are the conversations you now feel prompted to have? So that summarises that extract, the approach to theology which we were taking in the project. I would say that this approach has been well received by some, but passed over by others, as stakeholders have focused, understandably, on the requests for change. But 7 of those requests for change have asked for further theological work to be done, and so we wait with interest to see by whom and in what way those requests for further theological work are picked up. I'm also going to introduce our 5th and final theme, which is about communicating our just knowledge in a way that enables it to be received. In some research, communicating is what you do when the research is over. In Project Violet, it was an integral part of the way in which the project sought to bring about institutional and systemic change. It is one thing to offer new knowledge and new ways of knowing. It is another to communicate that knowledge in a way that can be both received and recognised as different. We had 2 intentions in designing the communication to the Baptist community. First, that we communicate using a range of approaches, knowing that different people will tune into different media. And second, that everything produced should be polyvocal, emphasising both the diversity and solidarity between women. In all our efforts, we were supported by a professional and enthusiastic communications team at Baptist House, who worked hard to make the rough places smooth, and we express our gratitude to them. Let me briefly mention 7 different media and suggest how they communicated the purposes of the project. There was and still is an extensive project website which invites people to explore and read. All the resources we generated are gathered here, including a growing library of women's writing about women's ministry, and good reads about gender. We held termly online seminars intended to invite questions and build solidarity. We maintained a social media presence on Facebook and Twitter, what I might call surf and turf, enabling the project to take up public space, but facilitating short engagements. We had a film made, which Jane fronted, called A Name to Live Up To. And this film introduced the missional reasons for addressing gender injustice and contextualised the research in a wider world of women's justice seeking. We created some podcasts, The aim of season 1 was to educate people about the history of women's ministry and the language they would need to discuss gender justice. The aim of season 2 was to introduce the co-researchers and allow them to say why they wanted their reports to be read. We also created posters and artwork. Each piece of research was turned into a poster by a graphic artist, and the posters were displayed at conferences and events around the country. 2 of our co-researchers commissioned a piece of artwork, which was displayed alongside the posters. The aim of these was to elicit an emotional response, and that was certainly witnessed on many occasions. A final means of communication was liturgy. The General Secretary of the Baptist Union, Lynn Green, took responsibility for working with others to create resources for lament, which have been used to express anger and sadness at the injustices which the research has uncovered. As we've already outlined, our final communication was through a sequence of 3 reports to the Baptist community as a whole. Firstly, the findings with their requests for change, theological reflections and co-researcher reports. Secondly, the commitment to action report, where all the stakeholders' responses were recorded. And then thirdly, an accountability report, which is yet to be written, but which will ask all stakeholders to report on the progress they have made. What we didn't do was create any executive summaries, any handy 2-page handouts. The shortest document is a 5-page overview of the findings. There really is a lot of material to read, but it has been an effort to generate it and articulate this just knowledge. So we think it's fair to expect some effort to engage with it. It has taken nerve to communicate in this way. It's neither the normal way in which denominations communicate, nor the normal way in which academic research is reported. But we felt that using past patterns of communication would not convey that this is an attempt to redress epistemic injustice.
So in conclusion, in this paper, we have tried to describe and evaluate the methods we've used to co-create knowledge that did justice to women's experience of ministry across Baptists together. We are early in the process of evaluating what has been done, so welcome other insights, questions and reflections, particularly around our 5 themes. So the first, stakeholder engagement, awakening those with the power to change. Secondly, mosaic reflections, women's stories as private public knowledge. Third, the use of women-only spaces, helping co-researchers find their voice. Fourth, theology drawn from experience, not from normative statements. And lastly, communicating in a way that enables the knowledge to be received.
Thank you, Jane. So we'd love to engage with you. The restrictions of technology mean that your only way of communicating with us is through the Q&A box. And so we hope you will type furiously into that in order to communicate with us. Clara will chair a Q&A session where she will read out to us questions which you have submitted. But we would invite you now to make a contribution in response to this question. Thinking of examples of injustice you have experienced or witnessed, what kind of knowledge was seen as influential in bringing about change? I'll repeat that question because it encapsulates what we've been trying to say this evening. Thinking of examples of injustice that you have experienced or witnessed, what kind of knowledge was seen as influential in bringing about change? So we're now in your hands. If you don't type things into the Q&A, there's going to be quite a pause. So we hope you will feel empowered to do that, and we can start to engage with your thoughts, which we're really interested to hear what you've got to say as we continue to develop our thinking about the project. So I'll hand back to Clara, and we'll keep an eye open for what you've got to say as it comes in.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Jane. That's been really interesting to listen to. Even though I've been involved in the project, there's always more to learn, and there's always bits of it that I wasn't aware of. Just whilst we're waiting for people to reflect on that question, wondering if you could say a little bit more, because this is an ecumenical gathering tonight, whether you could say a little bit more about the ecumenical engagement and the group that met and the kind of themes and issues that they came up with.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off, Clara. So from memory, it was a while ago now, there were, Helen will chip in as well, kind of 5 or 6 different denominations. And we invited somebody kind of younger and perhaps new in ministry from that particular denomination. And then they connected with a senior person, not in age, but in terms of experience with somebody in their denomination, which was a really good model in itself, because that meant that, you know, 2 Anglicans, for example, might not have met, and they connected and built a kind of relationship. And the model we use the language of gifts and wounds. So it was hosting a day where we could hear from different denominations and share what are the gifts that we want to offer each other. So if you think of the kind of synodal conversation, synodality, which is what the kind of Catholic Church have engaged in recently, although, yeah, they're still working that out, I think, and will be now with Pope Leo. And the idea was that we could exchange these gifts, but also hear the wounds. And I recall one talking about the whole calling experience and revisiting their ordination vows. And, you know, that really challenged me, but made others think about, well, what do we do when we are called into ministry, and how do we celebrate it in different traditions? Helen, you might want to add to that.
Yeah, no, we received some really interesting contributions. Because I'm a Salvationist, I was keen to invite 2 women ministers from the Salvation Army, and they've had women ministers since their founding over 150 years ago, but they were still able to point to patterns of disadvantage that women ministers had experienced, and they felt that perhaps there was a pressure on women always to say yes to opportunities, and that could bring its own pressure, and that there had historically been different expectations of married and single women, which also created different pressures. And so they talked about, as women took on more senior roles, relaxing into the opportunities rather than always feeling obliged to say yes. There were 2 women there from independent church networks, and they said some really interesting things about the emphasis in their tradition being on how ministers enable and empower disciples rather than their own leadership. And so actually any successful leader would be one who was bringing forth the talents of women in the church, and therefore that focus on the minister as being either male or female was secondary to their ability to involve all the people of God in the life of the church. So there were some really interesting things which we felt were gifts which the Baptist community could receive, and they were written up as part of the findings. I guess we've just outed an interesting ecumenical feature of the project is that I'm not a Baptist, and Jane is very much a Baptist, and so that for us was an important insider-outsider relationship between us, in that I certainly asked more than my fair share of stupid questions during the course of the project, and that was actually helpful in articulating some of the assumptions that were going on. And Jane miraculously didn't seem to get bored of answering them, which shows what a very patient person she is.
I mean, maybe it's just worth saying on Clara, the kind of insider-outsider relationship, because you know, it was really interesting for me to watch, kind of as Helen and I worked more closely together, and kind of, you know, didn't quite live with each other in terms of the bulk of the project. But it was really fascinating how people related to Helen, and, you know, I could observe that quite from, well, just an interesting perspective. But it did feel to me that Helen moved, you know, quite a lot as an insider as well. Yeah, it was just fascinating to see that you know, people's respect for Helen, and yeah, just respect of her knowledge of kind of Baptist life, and I think that's worth noting, and certainly I observed that. So I do feel that you became quite an insider, Helen, but could still keep the kind of outsider difficult questions that she can ask at times, but really insightful. Yeah.
We have a first response to your question, so I'm going to read that out, and then maybe we'll have some space for you to respond and reflect back. So the response is, in response to your question, I think the power of hearing stories that make you aware of issues that you are not conscious of, and also listening to those sharing the stories of what might help, and listening together to God and to each other to find a way forward. I think the power of hearing stories that make you aware of issues that you're not conscious of, and also listening to those sharing the stories of what might help, and listening together to God and to each other to find a way forward.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's coming from, I recognise the name. It's one of our co-researchers who's done that. So it's great to have one of them in the room. And yes, I think that's very true. I think one of the things that we wanted to tackle in this project was the sense that there was a single Baptist woman who, if she was satisfied, everything would be fine, it would all be over, and that there was one way in which one particular way of looking at things which all Baptist women had. And of course that's, you know, that certainly wouldn't be true of Baptist men, it's certainly not true of Baptist women. So I think it's really helpful for women to understand the differences between them, and that different women quite legitimately wanted different things and needed different things, and that diversity was something which needed to be celebrated and responded to, rather than try to simplify it in a way that was unhelpful and suggested that it was just one view of what women wanted. We did use quite widely the sort of jargon term for this, which is intersectionality, which is a term which is in growing recognition and popularity, but probably was just coming into popular use as we started the project. I think the easiest way of expressing it is to say that if you're both a woman and disabled, you can't have a day off from being either a woman or from being disabled. And so when something difficult happens, you're left wondering, was it because I was disabled, or was it because I was a woman? And so that intersection between different identities is something which many women have to navigate, and adds to the complexity of their experience of injustice, and yet further means that they can self-edit their contribution out of the picture. And my sense that as we work together as a team of co-researchers, this listening to each other sensitized us more to the different narratives which other women were bringing, and made us more aware of our own assumptions, and helped us assume that our narrative was the dominant narrative. And that's particularly true for white women. There's often an assumption that they have the truest narrative when it comes to articulating women's injustice. So that was hugely important.
I'm aware, because I've read all of those reports, not once, but several times, I'm aware of the huge range of different questions and different issues that women explored. I wondered if you could just give us a bit of a flavour of some of those topics, some of those areas of interest.
So the kind of research topics themselves, Clara, that kind of women were asking. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one was it's kind of fresh on my mind because I'm doing some writing, as you know, for my own doctoral research, and some of the writing that I'm doing at the moment is around some of the pain and some of the challenges. So I was just reading the one about kind of why, you know, Baptist ministers are leaving, for example. So that was one that one of our co-researchers explored, and even reading that, it's kind of raising for me other questions that need answering. So if anybody's out there listening and wants to do some research, but this sense of actually what do we do when people leave then, and how do we kind of follow that up? So that was one of the topics. I know that there's somebody on the line as well, our kind of first questioner, who looked at kind of menopause and some of the challenges around health that we don't always talk about as women. Yeah, so it's the two that are kind of on my mind. Helen?
Yeah, amongst our group of Black and Brown women, one woman looked at the challenges which Black and Brown women find in funding their ministerial education, and whether the ways of working in Baptist life recognises some of the additional challenges which they might face. Another woman looked at the take-up of race awareness training in Baptist life and how that had been received. Another a brown woman looked at the experience of Asian women entering ministry, both in terms of how it was received by their congregation, but how it was received by their wider family network as well. So a really huge range of questions, I think most of which we couldn't have predicted, which is, I think, is another beauty of working in a participative way. They knew what the right questions were to ask, and asking the questions they did showed up a whole range of issues, which actually turned out to be sort of a good fractal reflection of wider Baptist life. So giving away the research questions to the co-researchers feels like the right strategy. I see we've had two really helpful reflections. Oh, yeah, come in. I don't know whether you want to share those with people, Clara, but they're really great reflections.
Yes, I'll read those out and then let you respond. Maybe we'll look at them one at a time because there's a lot in these. So the first one says, I am a lone parent from a working class cis female priest, also part of the LGBT community. I often feel that my voice is not taken as seriously as middle class female priests. I think for me, it's acknowledging the levels of privilege in our own communities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, agree with that. And I think I mean that well, just the language of voice is really interesting. And I'm just reading Gilligan's work. Some of you may be familiar with that. Quite a seminal work in terms of in a different voice. And that's kind of picked up in the Church of England recently. Some work by Liz Shercliffe, who I think you know, Clara, but she's written a lot about voice and her research. And just reading both, Gilligan's work was kind of 40, 50 years ago, and then reading what's happening today. But people are saying the same thing, that voice is not taken seriously. So I just agree with that, and thanks for naming it.
Yeah,
I'm really pleased to see that the Church of England is now starting to both initiate research. Liz Graveling in Ministry Division has initiated some research on class, and it's starting to be addressed theologically. But it is a much more difficult intersection to name, particularly when the dominant culture is middle class. There can be a real embarrassment about naming it, and yet it's in many denominations, it is a very live issue. So particularly grateful for you naming that, but I think also naming how difficult it is to articulate it, and the more intersections that we sit at, the more difficult it is to find a voice, because we have these multiple lenses which we feel are gazes which are being used to look at us, and therefore can lead to this self-editing behaviour.
Thank you, Helen. And another reflection just in the injustice I've experienced has been deeply intersectional, beginning with age, being considered too young, then gender, followed by race, class, and so on. At times it feels suffocating. When I was given a position in church leadership, I found myself juggling family responsibilities, work, and ministry. Yet the support I received as a woman in leadership was noticeably less than what men often receive. It can feel like we're being set up to fail, expected to carry the same burdens without the same backing. Studying feminist theology helped me to make sense of what I was going through. Listening to the testimonies of other women gave me back my voice and helped me reclaim my boundaries. Now I don't overextend myself. I offer my presence and support when I am truly available, not out of guilt or pressure, but from a place of strength.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Just echoes, I think, some of what I said earlier, but, you know, listening to the testimonies of other women gave me back my voice and helped me reclaim my boundaries. That's quite a powerful thing, isn't it? And I've wondered about that because, you know, I've thought really quite recently, do we still need women-only spaces? And kind of doing the Project Violet research has, for me, just confirmed that even more, that yes, we do, and other groups as well. Yeah, picking up on what's already been said. Yeah, and I'm just sorry still, and I continue to lament that women, you know, are kind of faced with these challenges and receive less support, and yeah, set up to fail for some, and that's painful.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah. Got a question here. Did anyone look at the impact of having young children?
Not directly, no. There had been some previous work done on ministers as mothers in the Baptist Union, and the results of that research and the booklet were already on the Baptist Union website. And so we were interested to notice that no women chose that particular topic. There was a woman looked at the implications of being a carer, and that's for her it extended to both adult relatives and children, but a specific piece of research on being a mother wasn't included, although I think it came up tangentially in quite a number of the pieces of research. So a couple of the co-researchers talked about the process of moving churches, which in Baptist life is called settlement. And during that process, there's an interaction between representatives of the church and the potential minister. And unsurprisingly, you're going to be astonished to learn that sometimes those interactions include questions about children, either the absence of them or the presence of them, and the assumptions of the church about the theology of family life and who should do what in family life become evident in these conversations. Really excited to say that a recommendation for change was made, and that's been picked up by one of our regional ministers in London, who was a co-researcher, and she, working with a retired regional minister, have just published a resource on the process of settlement and how to deal with conversations about gender and family life during that process. So that for me is a really good example of hopefully no church is ever going to be able to say, well, we didn't know. There will be a regional minister who said there is a resource, you need to engage with that resource if you're going to interview women or people with children, so that you have thought that through before you engage in this process. So I think that's an example of a positive change that's come from the research. Another thing I just want to say is there are a lot more questions to be asked. So one of the things that we hope is that in future it will not come as a surprise if somebody raises a question of injustice, and there will be a willingness to receive practitioner research and the recommendations that come from it, and to acknowledge that this type of knowledge is a just knowledge, and it's a knowledge which is worth engaging with. So you certainly can't cover all that needs to be covered in 16 pieces of research, but you can show that practitioner research is a valuable thing to do and a just thing to do.
I have another couple of responses that have come in here. This one is saying, I'm aware that often women in regional ministry do not remain in that position as long as men do. Was any research done into this area, and why do you think this might be the case?
It's a good question. I'm aware of the person who's asking this question. It's true. So for those online that aren't aware of this, so we have regional ministers kind of work in translocal spaces, and they will have some measure of oversight of a particular association. And the direct answer is, again, picking up on what Helen said, there's more to be done, and there is more to be done. That there wasn't any research done on this particular question. I think it's a great question and an area for further research. And I think just to say that in conversations at various points throughout Project Filer, this cropped up from time to time, and people just noticed if they were doing research and they wanted particular stats and figures on things. And it, it's made me wonder, well, for us and perhaps other denominations, but if I had more resource, I'd want to do a project called Hidden Figures. I'd want to be really explicit with the figures from all our denominations and, to highlight in some creative way and say, well, actually, do you really know? Because I think, to be honest, we don't know because we don't know. And we don't know what we don't know. So I think it needs highlighting. It's a great question.
I think I just want to respond by saying, although there wasn't research done into why women maybe don't stay in regional ministry as long as men, there was a piece of research by a co-researcher that did look at the experience of translocal ministry. And that spoke really powerfully, I think, to some of the reasons why it might be difficult for women to stay in these roles. Into things like not being heard, being very much in a minority in a very male gendered space. So I think they're not directly, but indirectly, yes, I think there was research done in this area.
Yeah. I think if that issue is of interest to you, I'd encourage you to access that particular co-researcher's report. It's in the form of a film. It's by Haley Young, and I think there's a lot of implicit answers in that film as to why women find regional ministry particularly difficult.
Yeah. I have another reflection here by someone who says, I don't want to be greedy in offering another thought. I would like to say to that person, you're not being greedy at all. As women, we're trained not to take up space, and sometimes actually it's valuable when we do take up a bit of space. But this person is saying, I think communicating the research reports in the visually engaging graphic posters and using them in Visio Divina at events like conferences or regional days have been a powerful, effective and accessible way of facilitating reflection and engagement with the research with a wide range of people, both women and men, and also raising allies and enthusiasm for responding to the requests for change. So that's referring really to the graphic posters, I think.
Yeah. Thank you for that feedback. It was I think at times we definitely felt that we'd bitten off more than we could chew. I think that's fair to say, Jane, isn't it? In taking on all these communications projects, they often sort of piled in on top of each other, the timelines that we were struggling to engage with. But we were, I feel that the extra mile we went in generating all these 7 different approaches to communication was justified, and the response to the posters was particularly powerful, both from the women, the co-researchers, when they saw them for the first time and saw their own research replicated in a poster, and then from the occasions in which they were used, and they generated conversations in the way in which a text just doesn't. So it was I was very pleased that we did it.
Yeah, I would echo that, Helen. Just a quick story, if I may, of so one of our co-researchers is a deaf woman minister, and I observed her at the Baptist Assembly looking at the graphic recorder, which as part of that is a picture of a woman pushing a boulder up a mountain, and she was signing this to her another deaf minister. And they were both like visibly moved, and they both got it, saying how hard it was. And I just watched them engage with the graphic as I stood back, and it was just really moving to see it. But as a visual image, it was just worked brilliantly for them and so many, as already been said. And that was an ecumenical colleague, a Methodist, Anne Howlett Foster. Big shout out for her, who does this as part of her work.
I think one of the things I'd like to reflect on a little bit is the conference that we held with all of those co-researchers when we first saw all the posters, and the actual impact of being invited to read all of the research reports kind of in one go, and then to see the posters. And out of those conversations, we came up with another request for change, which wasn't actually part of any of the initial reports, which was the request for lament. Just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that for us.
Yeah.
I think for me that was a really important outcome of the conference, was that people collectively were able to articulate something which hadn't arisen either from their individual work or from the small group work. And I think the fact that that arose, well, I was going to say naturally from a conversation, but that's not what I believe. I think they were spirit-filled, the conversations. And so people entered that event very open to what the Spirit might say to them in discerning the requests for change that we were going to make. And so I think it was both spirit-filled that request was articulated, and then that all the women present were able to affirm it, and that people have now been proactive in acting upon that. A number of women, including you, Clara, have created liturgical material. We've had people create artistic resources. We've even had a bagpipe lament commissioned and shared. There's been an incredible range of a woman has again spontaneously produced a voiced piece, which she's spoken about her own experience of ministry across her lifetime. And so just the range of responses that people have made through that theme of lament, I think, has been very effective. And everything's sitting there on the website as well, so people can go and access that material and use it in different ways and in different contexts. And so for me, that's making public. If the Mosaic phase was about keeping public knowledge private in order to safeguard individual women, the lament is making public the fact that there is injustice, there is sadness, there are things which need to be articulated in a way that's owned collectively, and means that people can't say it's just me, or is it just me, or am I being unreasonable, all those self-editing phrases which often women use to silence themselves. This is a very public announcing of things are not good, they have not been good, and they need to be addressed.
Yeah, I just echo all of that, and yeah, that the resources that are there, they've been used kind of, different events across the country in different groups and individuals, and I think given freedom as well for some people to, be creative, Clara, and either create their own lament or, engage with others in a group. So yeah, I'm glad people have responded to that in that way.
I think in many ways, although it wasn't thought out to be a way of engaging other people in responding, I think it has given voice to other people who may not have been part of the research process itself, to kind of see themselves in the stories and in the research, and to be able to participate in that kind of communal lament. So I think that has been immensely important. And also, I think we have a tendency within our Baptist world to always look for the good news. We want to jump to the good news, the celebrating, the change, without necessarily stopping and actually really feeling the pain and feeling the, just the sorrow of those different reports, of those different stories. So I think it was really valuable in meaning that we actually stopped and did that, rather than trying to get straight onto the resurrection and the good news. We've got a few more minutes. I haven't got any more comments coming in at the moment, but if you have any, please do put them up in the Q&A. I just wanted to reflect a little bit more. You mentioned at the beginning the international conference. Would you mind just saying a little bit more about how that came about and how that unfolded?
I'll let you, Helen, as you were, I think, keen to do that. I was overwhelmed at this point.
Yeah, it's really funny. Again, this just shows ecumenical differences and what you take for granted. I suppose I come from a tradition where the instinct is to always have an international conversation about things, a very internationalist denomination, and where it's very common for ministers to know ministers in other countries and to be in dialogue with them. So it seemed to me absolutely obvious that this was the thing to do. And it was only when I announced it that I got lots of looks that I thought, oh, maybe this isn't the obvious thing to do. actually, I'm really pleased we did it. There was a group of 5 of us at Regent's Park, women on the staff, got together as a sort of organising committee, and we put out a call for papers, and we used the different networks to reach out to women. And actually, we heard from women from places you might expect, like America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but we also had a very powerful panel from women in Ghana, a woman from Peru, Jamaica, who just gave us very different insights into women's experience of ministry. But yet there was a feeling amongst the whole group of us on screen that actually there are lots of things that people recognized. And actually the women from Ghana said, we thought it was only us, that it was only women in Africa who had these experiences, you know. So they were, yeah, they were full of affirmation about hearing resonances of their experience and the experiences of other women. And so I think that's created a better awareness of the stage which women in other parts of the world are. And actually, Jane, you're going to the Baptist World Alliance Congress, aren't you, in July? And I think you get a speaking part, is that right?
Yeah, I've been invited to speak about Project Violet to the Baptist global community, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's just part of solidarity, isn't it? Knowing that these are experiences which are being, you know, there are contextual differences, but there are also real solidarities between women around the world. And so being aware of those and understanding their journeys is a source of real strength, I think.
Thank you. One of the things I'm very aware of when we're encouraging people to put research together is that final sort of chapter where we ask them to say, well, just imagine what next. You don't have to do it, but actually, where would you want to focus your energy next? So I think a good way to maybe finish this evening is to just have a little bit of a think about where might this go next? What would you like to see? What would you hope to see? Not just for Baptists, but much wider than that, ecumenically. What do you think would be some possible next steps?
It's a good question, Clara. Yeah, I mean, well, my first reaction is kind of I don't say no more, but as I'm, you know, in the throes of finishing my kind of doctoral research, which is connected to Project Violet, you know, there's a bit of me that I just want to kind of obviously finish that. I mean, just responding on a personal level, it's got me really excited about research and theological action research. So the more I think I'm getting to a different stage with my own research, I'm starting to dream a little bit more about what could be. But I think wouldn't this be amazing to do this for, you know, other groups across and kind of as a Churches Together project, and to learn from each other and to go deeper. Yeah, but beyond that, I just need to write my own doctorate, which yeah, but to write up the story of Project Violet as well, I'd love to do that.
Yeah.
Helen will have a million ideas. So.
Oh, and then Helen, over to you.
I think our immediate next steps are to do some academic writing, because what we've done is not only important in terms of Baptist life and the life of the church, it's also important academically, in enabling such a large-scale piece of work to be done by women about their experiences. And so it's important to the field of practical theology to communicate that. So we'll be doing some work on that. I think I hope that Project Violet is a sort of a bit of a witness statement for women and other denominations to say, well, gosh, if the Baptists can do it, surely we could do something. And I think that's, you know, I think there's a lot to be commended about Baptist life, that they have looked sexism squarely in the face and said this is not something that we're going to pretend doesn't exist, and it's not something we're going to look away from. We are going to look this in the face. Now, you obviously don't get a whole new world immediately, but just the sheer act of saying sexism is real, It's real in its effects. It is detrimental in its effects in allowing the full flourishing of women and them being all that God intends them to be. That's not something we can accept, and therefore it's something we will address institutionally rather than put the pressure on women to become more confident, develop themselves, be more assertive, you know, all the things that women hear time and time again. And so I do hope it will be an encouragement to women in other traditions to feel that this is doable, it's manageable. Okay, it lasted 3 years, but Jane and I were only working a day a week on it throughout that period. So it's not beyond the resources of most denominations to do this. And everybody's clearly got to do it in a way which this is being handcrafted to be suitable to Baptist life. Other denominations would do it differently. But I do hope it's an ecumenical gift to say it is possible for denominations to look sexism squarely in the face and say this is something that we need to address. And I think if that witness is heard, that for me will be a huge positive.
That feels, Helen, a really good point to just stop and say thank you so much, Helen and Jane, for all that you've done through Project Violet, but also for taking the time to think through how it might be helpful to talk about that with a wider audience here this evening. I've certainly deepened my knowledge of Project Violet, and I'm left going away thinking about what do I do as a result of this? What's the next step for me? And I hope that others will take that back to their own context, their own churches, and be asking some of the same questions. So just a massive thank you, Jane, a massive thank you, Helen, and to Mike, who's been behind the scenes doing the tech tonight. It all seems to have gone very smoothly. Thank you so much. And to Churches Together in Britain and Ireland for hosting us. Thank you. And I think we'll say good night.